My billionaire husband treated me like a trophy, so I found a new toy. His adopted son, a brutal MMA fighter. While my husband was away, we turned his penthouse into our playground. We didn't just sleep together. We conspired to steal his entire fortune. I gathered the evidence, I prepared the blackmail, and I walked into my husband's office to destroy him, completely unaware that I was walking straight into a nightmare. The morning in the penthouse on Manhattan began with the customary symphony of high-altitude luxury, a rhythm I had memorized down to the second. There was the delicate, almost musical chime of a silver spoon stirring coffee in porcelain, the dry rustle of a freshly ironed newspaper, and the muted, distant hum of the city rising from the streets 60 floors below. I sat at the head of the long Italian marble dining table, my posture rigid and flawless, looking less like a wife and more like a porcelain figurine placed there for decoration. I was wearing a silk robe the color of vintage champagne, the fabric cool against my skin, and my hair was pinned up in a chignon that looked effortless but had taken my stylist 40 minutes to perfect. Across the expanse of white stone sat Robert, the architect of this golden cage. At 45, he was a masterpiece of maintenance and discipline. His suit was tailored to the millimeter, his skin glowed with the health of expensive spa treatments, and the silver at his temples only served to increase his gravity in the boardroom. He was speaking in his low, modulated baritone about the upcoming charity auction, instructing me on the necessity of wearing the emerald necklace to match the theme of the evening. I nodded at the appropriate intervals, curving my lips into the smile I had spent 3 years perfecting in front of the vanity mirror. A precise chemical mixture of submissive listening and adoring fascination. Robert did not require conversation. He required an audience, and I was the best performer he had ever purchased. He finished his espresso, folded his napkin with geometric precision, and stood up to leave. He leaned over and pressed a dry, perfunctory kiss to my cheek, a gesture that felt more like a seal of ownership than an act of affection. He checked his watch, threw a final comment about the driver waiting downstairs, and walked out of the dining room, leaving behind a lingering trail of sandalwood cologne and a sudden, deafening vacuum of silence. I let out a long, shaky breath, allowing my shoulders to drop for the first time that morning. The pressure of maintaining the perfect picture was beginning to throb behind my temples, a dull ache that warned of a long, empty day ahead. I reached for a croissant, my hand trembling slightly, desperate for a moment of genuine comfort in this museum of a home. The heavy oak door to the dining room swung open without a knock, the sound shattering the fragile piece I had just managed to gather. I froze, my hand hovering over the pastry basket, as the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from sterile cool to something hot and volatile. Marcus walked in. He was Robert's adopted son, the boy brought into the family years ago to soften the billionaire's shark-like image with a heartwarming story of philanthropy, but the man who stood before me now was no charity case. He was 25 years old, a professional MMA fighter, and he occupied space with a terrifying raw intensity that was the polar opposite of his father's polished restraint. He had just returned from his morning run, and the air around him seemed to vibrate with kinetic energy. He was wearing nothing but low-slung athletic shorts, his body a map of corded muscle and dark, glistening skin that seemed to absorb the light in the room rather than reflect it. He did not speak a word of greeting. He moved with the heavy, prowling grace of a predator that knows it is at the top of the food chain, ignoring the chair opposite me to stand directly at the edge of the table. His chest heaved with the aftershocks of his exertion, and the smell of him, a potent mix of sweat, rain, and raw musk, assaulted my senses, instantly overpowering the polite scent of fresh coffee and lilies. It was a smell of violence and life, shocking in the climate-controlled purity of the penthouse. He reached out with a hand wrapped in hand tape and grabbed the crystal carafe of water intended for the guests. Instead of pouring it into a glass, he lifted the heavy vessel to his lips and drank straight from the rim, his throat working rhythmically as he downed the ice-cold liquid. He didn't look at the water. He looked at me. His eyes were dark, unblinking, and locked onto mine with the intensity that stripped away my silk robe and my social status in a single heartbeat. I watched, mesmerized and horrified, as a stream of water escaped the corner of his mouth and trailed down his chin, cutting a path through the sweat on his neck before disappearing into the dark hair on his chest. Propriety dictated that I should reprimand him. that I should act the part of the offended stepmother and demand he show some manners. But the words turned to dust in my throat. My mouth went suddenly painfully dry. There was no filial respect in the way he looked at me, no recognition of the boundaries that were supposed to exist between a father's wife and a son. There was only a challenge, a predatory, dangerous heat that turned my blood to ice and fire simultaneously. In that silence, broken only by his heavy breathing and the setting of the crystal decanter back onto the marble with a sharp clack, the cozy safety of the dining room evaporated, replaced by the terrifying realization that I was locked in a cage with a tiger who had just realized the door was unlocked. The days that followed that first breakfast dissolved into a slow, suffocating rhythm of beige luxury, a parade of hours that felt less like living and more like waiting to be dusted. My calendar was filled, of course, because Robert believed that idleness bred discontent, but the appointments were nothing more than expensive fillers designed to keep me ornamental and occupied. I spent my mornings selecting floral arrangements that would die within 48 hours, my afternoons nodding politely at charity luncheons where women with frozen foreheads discussed poverty while wearing the GDP of a small nation on their wrists, and my evenings acting as the decorative centerpiece at Robert's business dinners. I was drowning in a sea of meaningless transactions, buying things I didn't need with money I didn't earn, feeling the atrophy of my soul accelerate with every swipe of the black credit card. The penthouse, with its climate-controlled air and soundproof glass, began to feel less like a home and more like a high-altitude vault where I was kept in suspended animation, preserved in a state of flawless, boring perfection. However, in this landscape of sterile predictability, a new gravitational center emerged, a dark star that began to pull my orbit away from the safe, well-lit corridors of my husband's expectations. The home gymnasium, a sprawling complex of chrome and rubber located in the isolated east wing of the apartment, became the focal point of my existence. Initially, I fabricated excuses to be there that were flimsy at best, checking on the efficiency of the cleaning staff, ensuring the humidity controls were protecting the expensive equipment, or claiming that the light in the adjacent lounge was superior for reading my French novels. But these were transparent lies I told myself to mask the raw voyeuristic hunger that actually drew me down that long hallway. I wasn't there to read or to supervise, I was there to watch. I was there to stand in the shadows of the doorway or sit feigning disinterest by the panoramic window, while my eyes drank in the violence and the vitality that exploded in that room every single afternoon. Marcus trained with a ferocity that was terrifying to witness, a focused rage that turned the act of exercise into a simulation of war. He didn't just work out, he dismantled himself and rebuilt the pieces in real time. I would sit with an open book on my lap, the pages unturned for an hour, mesmerized by the way he moved. He attacked the heavy bag with a rhythm that sounded like gunfire, a rapid staccato of impacts that echoed off the high ceilings and vibrated in the floorboards beneath my feet. Every strike was delivered with lethal intent, a release of kinetic energy that seemed to shake the very air in the room. His body was a revelation, a stark contrast to the soft, manicured men I interacted with in Robert's world. Marcus was a machine of destruction, carved from obsidian and steel, sweating and grunting in a display of raw, unpolished masculinity that made the civilized veneer of the penthouse feel fragile and fraudulent. Watching him became a dangerous addiction, a secret vice that made my pulse hammer in my throat. I saw the way the muscles in his back coiled and released like snakes beneath his dark skin when he did pull-ups, the way the veins in his forearms bulged when he gripped the iron bars of the weights. There was an honesty in his exertion that was lacking in every other aspect of my life. He wasn't pretending. He wasn't smiling for a camera or shaking hands to close a deal. He was bleeding effort, pushing his physical form to the absolute limit of endurance. It was primal, and it woke something up in me that I thought had died the day I signed the prenuptial agreement. I found myself dressing for these inspections with a subconscious deliberation, choosing dresses that were slightly too sheer, applying perfume to pulse points that no one should have been close enough to smell. I was circling the fire, terrified of being burned but freezing to death without the heat. The inevitable collision occurred on a Tuesday in November, a day when the city outside was lashed by a freezing rain that turned the skyline into a blur of gray static. Robert had flown to London early that morning for a series of high-stakes negotiations regarding a merger, leaving the penthouse feeling cavernous and unsupervised. The absence of his controlling presence acted like a depressurization of the cabin, The air felt thinner, sharper, charged with the possibility of misconduct. I spent the morning wandering through the empty rooms, touching objects I didn't care about, until the familiar rhythmic thudding from the east wing drew me in like a moth to a flame. I walked down the corridor, the sound growing louder with every step, a drumbeat that matched the escalating tempo of my own heart. I told myself I was just going to check on the leak in the skylight, a lie so pathetic I didn't even bother to finish formulating it in my mind. When I pushed open the double doors of the gym, the smell hit me first, a heavy, thick wall of musk, old leather, and testosterone that instantly coated the back of my throat. It was the scent of a predator's den. Marcus was in the center of the sparring ring, finishing a session with his private trainer, a burly ex-fighter who looked small and defensive compared to the force of nature attacking him. Marcus was moving in a blur, dodging and striking with a fluidity that was beautiful in its violence. He was shirtless, his skin slick with sweat, gleaming under the harsh track lighting. As I stepped fully into the room, the click of my heels on the floor cut through the sounds of exertion. Marcus froze mid-strike, his head snapping toward me. He stared for a second, his chest heaving, and then without breaking eye contact with me, he jerked his head at the trainer. "Get out!" he barked, the command breathless but absolute. The trainer didn't argue. He scrambled to gather his gear and brushed past me, leaving us alone in the sudden ringing silence. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly, condensing into a thick, humid pressure that made it difficult to breathe. We were alone, truly alone, in a way we had never been before. The safety buffer of the trainer, the household staff, and Robert's looming shadow was gone. I stood by the door, suddenly acutely aware of my vulnerability, dressed in a silk blouse and pencil skirt that felt ridiculous in this arena of sweat and blood. Marcus stood in the center of the ring, unwinding the tape from his hands with slow, deliberate movements, his eyes never leaving my face. He didn't come to me. He waited, forcing me to bridge the distance. My knees trembled, but I walked toward the ropes, drawn by a magnetism I could no longer resist. I needed to re-establish the hierarchy. I needed to remind him, and myself, that I was the mistress of this house and he was merely a dependent, however dangerous he might look. I stopped a few feet from him, the heat radiating from his body hitting me like a physical wave. I tried to summon the voice I used with the caterers, the voice of the billionaire's wife. "Your father wouldn't approve of this intensity," I said, the words sounding tinny and weak in the vast room. "He thinks this aggression is bad for the family image. We are philanthropists, Marcus, not street brawlers. You need to tone it down." It was a pathetic attempt at dominance, a fragile shield made of paper. I talked about Robert's expectations, about the board of directors, about the facade of civility we were all paid to uphold. I was reciting a script, trying to hide the fact that I was staring at the line of sweat running down his abdomen, trying to ignore the way the air between us seemed to crackle with static electricity. Marcus let out a short, harsh laugh that was devoid of any humor. He tossed the balled-up hand tape into the corner and stepped over the ropes, closing the distance between us in 2 long strides. The sheer size of him up close was overwhelming. He towered over me, blocking out the light, consuming my field of vision. "The family image," he repeated, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards and into the soles of my feet. "You talk about him like he's a god, Elena. But you know what he really is." He took another step, invading my personal space, violating the social contract that kept us safe. "Robert doesn't have a family. He has a collection. He buys stocks, he buys companies, and he buys people." He looked down at me with a mixture of contempt and a dark, burning hunger that made my stomach flip. "He bought me out of a foster home because I looked good in the brochures," Marcus continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that was louder than a shout. "And he bought you because you look good on his arm. We aren't family, Elena. We're inventory." The brutality of his words was shocking, stripping away the romantic lies I told myself about my marriage. He was calling me a whore to my face, but he was doing it with an intimacy that turned the insult into a shared secret. "You're just the most expensive thing he owns," he murmured. "Same as this apartment. Same as my career. We are exactly the same, you and I. Just pets on a gold leash." He was dismantling my dignity, tearing down the walls of my denial, and yet I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the truth he was speaking and the dangerous proximity of his body. He raised his hand then. I flinched instinctively, expecting violence, expecting a blow that would match the fury in his eyes. But he didn't strike me. He reached out with a slowness that was agonizing and brought his hand to my face. His palm was rough, callous from years of fighting, hot and damp with sweat. He didn't cup my cheek gently. He pressed his thumb against my lower lip, dragging it across the soft skin with a pressure that was heavy and possessive. "You have something," he whispered, his eyes dropping to my mouth, darkening with intent. He rubbed my lip, erasing an invisible speck of dust, or perhaps erasing the ghost of his father's dry kisses. The touch was crude, disrespectful, and claiming. It was a violation of everything I was supposed to be, everything I was supposed to value. I should have slapped him. I should have recoiled in horror, marched out of the room, and called Robert in London to demand his son be thrown out on the street. My hand twitched at my side, the impulse to strike him warring with a sudden, overwhelming paralysis. But I didn't move. I stood there, frozen, my breath hitched in my throat, feeling the rough texture of his thumb against the sensitive skin of my lip. The heat of his body was burning through the thin silk of my dress, promising a kind of destruction I had never known. In that moment, looking up into his predatory eyes, I realized that the safety I had curated was a prison. Robert offered me cold diamonds and safety. Marcus offered me fire and ruin. And as his thumb pressed harder, parting my lips slightly, I felt a jolt of liquid heat pool in my belly, a terrifying acknowledgement that I didn't want to be safe anymore. I wanted to burn. The storm did not arrive with the polite warning of a darkening sky. It ambushed the city like a predatory animal, swallowing Manhattan whole in a matter of minutes. From the vantage point of the 60th floor, I watched the transformation with a glass of Pinot Noir in my hand, observing as the glittering diamond-hard skyline was erased by a wall of gray water. The skyscrapers, usually beacons of arrogant permanence, were reduced to ghostly silhouettes trembling behind the deluge, and the world outside the reinforced glass became a chaotic blur of wind and violence. The atmosphere inside the penthouse shifted in sympathy with the elements. The air pressure dropped, making my ears pop, and the shadows in the corners of the vast living room seemed to lengthen and deepen, creeping toward the center like ink spilling across a page. It was barely 7 o'clock in the evening, yet the light had been strangled out of the day, leaving the apartment submerged in a heavy, aquatic gloom that the dim mood lighting could barely penetrate. The phone call from Robert had come 10 minutes ago, a brief, static-filled transmission from the airport lounge in London. The storm had grounded all transatlantic flights. He would not be returning tonight. He was stuck on the other side of the ocean, raging at airline staff, leaving me alone in his castle high above the clouds. I stood in the center of the living room, the silence of the empty house pressing against my eardrums, feeling a vibration in the floorboards that might have been thunder, or just the pounding of my own blood. Robert's absence usually brought relief, a chance to exhale and drop the mask of the perfect wife, but tonight, the solitude felt charged and dangerous. I took a long sip of the wine, the expensive vintage tasting metallic and sharp on my tongue, doing little to quell the internal tremor that had started the moment I hung up the phone. I told myself I was just cold, that the storm had seeped through the insulation, but I knew it was a lie. I was waiting. I was listening. The house, usually so vast and echoing, felt suddenly intimate and claustrophobic, like a stage set where the actors were waiting for their cues. I moved to the sofa and sat down, my silk dress rustling loudly in the quiet, trying to focus on a magazine, but the words swam before my eyes. Then I heard it. The sound was faint at first, then unmistakable, heavy, deliberate footsteps descending the floating staircase from the upper level. They were not the tentative steps of a servant. They were the rhythmic, confident tread of the only other person in the house who claimed ownership of the space. My heart performed a traitorous, violent leap against my ribs, a physical reaction that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the dark, magnetic pull that had been growing between us for weeks. I didn't turn around immediately. I gripped the stem of my wine glass until my knuckles turned white, staring fixedly at the rain lashing against the window, forcing myself to breathe evenly. Marcus walked into my peripheral vision and stopped. He wasn't wearing the gym shorts from our last encounter. He was dressed in dark jeans and a fitted black shirt that disappeared into the shadows of the room, making his face and hands appear to float in the darkness. But the look in his eyes remained unchanged. It was the same gaze he had leveled at me in the gym, the same stripping, demanding stare that saw through the layers of couture and pretense to the bored, desperate woman underneath. He didn't say hello. He walked to the wet bar, the sound of his boots on the hardwood echoing like gunshots, and poured himself a drink without asking, the clink of the bottle against the glass ringing out in the tense silence. "The old man is grounded," Marcus said, his voice a low, rough texture that scraped against my nerves. He didn't turn to face me, watching my reflection in the mirror behind the bar instead. Stuck in the executive lounge with nothing but his BlackBerry and his rage. "I bet he's miserable." He took a sip of his bourbon and turned slowly, leaning back against the mahogany counter, his legs crossed at the ankles. "And here you are, the grieving widow, mourning his absence with a $20 bottle of wine." His tone was laced with a mockery that stung, a deliberate provocation designed to get under my skin. He knew exactly how much the wine cost. It was closer to $200, but he wanted to reduce it just as he wanted to reduce me. I finally turned to look at him, lifting my chin in a gesture of defiance that felt increasingly fragile. "It's a Pinot Noir, Marcus, and I am enjoying the quiet. Something that was absolute until 30 seconds ago." I tried to sound icy, imperious, the lady of the manor dismissing a rude servant, but my voice wavered, betraying the heat rising in my cheeks. He laughed, a dark, humorless sound, and began to walk toward me. He moved with a prowling, predatory grace, circling the sofa like a shark inspecting bait. "The quiet," he repeated, savoring the word as if it were a joke. "You hate the quiet, Elena. The quiet is when you have to think about what you actually are. That's why you fill this place with florists and caterers and friends who don't know your middle name. You're terrified of the quiet because that's when you realize you're just a bird in a gilded cage, waiting for your keeper to come home and put a cover over you." He stopped directly in front of me, blocking the view of the storm, his shadow falling over me like a heavy blanket. The air around him smelled of bourbon and rain, intoxicating and dangerous. "Admit it," he whispered, leaning down, his face inches from mine. "You're glad he's not coming home. You're glad it's just us." "You are drunk," I snapped, standing up abruptly to break the suffocating proximity. I tried to step around him, intending to retreat to the safety of my bedroom, to lock the door and hide until morning. "And you are forgetting your place. This is my house. You are a guest here, Marcus. A guest who lives on his father's charity." It was a low blow, a strike at his pride, and I knew it the moment the words left my lips. The atmosphere in the room snapped tight, the tension turning from simmering heat to sudden, violent volatility. Marcus didn't step aside. He moved with that terrifying speed I had seen in the ring, stepping into my path, forcing me to halt. His eyes flared with a cold fury. "Charity?" He spat the word out. "I earned every cent he gives me. I bleed for his image. I take the punches so he can look like a benevolent father. But what do you do, Elena? What do you give him in exchange for the diamonds? We both know what you are. You're a high-end escort with a ring." The insult hung in the air, gross and unforgivable. My hand flew up before I could think, driven by a surge of humiliation and rage, aiming for his face. But he was faster. He caught my wrist mid-air, his grip like a steel manacle, halting the strike inches from his cheek. We froze there, locked in a tableau of violence, breathing heavily. "Let go of me," I hissed, struggling against his hold, but he was immovable. He looked at my hand, then at my face, his expression shifting from anger to something darker, something hungrier. "Make me," he challenged softly. With his free hand, he reached out and struck the wine glass I was still holding in my other hand. It wasn't a fumble. It was a deliberate, violent slap. The crystal shattered against the edge of the coffee table, sending shards flying and splashing red wine across the pristine white wool carpet. The stain bloomed instantly, a jagged dark wound on the perfect purity of the room. It was a shocking act of destruction, a desecration of the order I had maintained so carefully. I gasped, looking down at the ruined carpet, but Marcus didn't let me look away. He yanked me forward, using the grip on my wrist to spin me around, and slammed me back against the wall beneath the curve of the staircase. The impact knocked the wind out of me, a sharp cry escaping my lips, but the sound was instantly smothered. He didn't give me a chance to recover. He pressed his body against mine, pinning me to the plaster with his weight, his hips grinding against me with a crude, undeniable dominance. The aggression in the gesture was terrifying. It was an assault on my space, my dignity, and my control. I opened my mouth to scream, to call for the security guard, to do anything, but he covered my mouth with his own. It wasn't a kiss. It was a collision. It was a declaration of war fought with teeth and tongues. He kissed me with a punishment and a hunger that erased everything else in the world. There was no tenderness in the way his hands roamed over my body. They were rough, seeking, tearing at the silk of my dress as if it were wrapping paper he was impatient to discard. And God help me, I didn't fight him. The shock of the violence dissolved into a liquid fire that flooded my veins. I didn't push him away. My hands, which had been fighting him seconds ago, clawed at his shoulders, pulling him closer, matching his fury with my own desperate need. This was not the dry, clinical lovemaking of my husband. This was raw, messy, and perilous. We were standing in the shadows of the grand hallway, exposed. The housekeeping staff could walk through the service door at any second. The security monitors were blinking in the control room. The risk of discovery was absolute. A guillotine blade hanging over our necks, and that danger acted like a drug, heightening every sensation until it was unbearable. He lifted me, his hands gripping my thighs, and I wrapped my legs around his waist, abandoning all dignity, abandoning the woman I was supposed to be. We were two animals tearing at each other in the dark, driven by a mutual loathing and a mutual lust that had been festering for months. As his teeth grazed my neck, leaving a mark that I would have to hide with makeup tomorrow, a realization crashed through my mind with the force of the thunder outside. I didn't care about the carpet. I didn't care about the storm. I didn't care about Robert stuck in London. In fact, the thought of Robert, his rules, his money, his cold perfection, felt like a distant, fading memory. Pressed against the wall by his son, gasping for air, consumed by a fire that threatened to burn the penthouse to the ground, I understood with a terrifying clarity that the lease on my soul had just changed hands. I was no longer the property of the man who had bought me. I belonged to the man who was currently breaking me apart. Our connection ceased to be a mere indiscretion and rapidly mutated into a full-blown chemical dependency, a toxic necessity that I craved with a physical hunger that frightened me. The penthouse, once a silent mausoleum of beige marble and empty hours, transformed into a theater of shadows where I waited for my cue. Marcus would come to me the moment Robert's town car dissolved into the traffic of the city below, slipping through the service corridors or appearing from the gym like a phantom summoned by my own desperate need. Every encounter felt like a free fall into a dark, bottomless chasm, a vertigo-inducing plunge where the landing didn't matter, only the rush of the air on the way down. We moved through the house like ghosts haunting the living, taking risks that bordered on the suicidal. A touch in the hallway while the housekeeper was in the next room. A stolen kiss in the pantry while the chef prepped dinner. The danger wasn't a deterrent. It was the accelerant. It stripped away the boredom that had calcified around my heart, and replaced it with a jagged, frantic rhythm that made me feel alive for the first time in years. I was no longer just the ornament on the shelf. I was the thief in the night stealing pleasure from under the nose of the dragon. But soon the raw, chaotic energy of our passion began to crystallize into something colder and more calculated. The breathless silence that followed our trysts, once filled only with the sound of our recovering heartbeats, began to fill with words. Lying in the tangled sheets of the guest bedroom, or pressed together on the sofa in the media room with the lights dimmed, I began to whisper my grievances. It started as a trickle, complaints about Robert's coldness, his controlling nature, the way he looked at me like an acquisition rather than a partner. But under Marcus's attentive, dark gaze, the trickle became a flood. I told him about the prenup, that ironclad document Robert had forced me to sign 3 days before the wedding. It was a masterpiece of legal cruelty. If I left him, I got a pittance. If I was caught in infidelity, I was thrown out with nothing but the clothes on my back. However, there was a loophole, a small shining exit door that I obsessed over. If the divorce was initiated by Robert due to scandal, or if he was proven to be financially negligent or incapacitated, the settlement shifted in my favor. It was a golden parachute, but the cord was locked in a box I couldn't open. Marcus listened to these confessions with a stillness that I mistook for empathy. He would run his heavy, calloused fingers through my hair, massaging my scalp with a hypnotic rhythm, his other hand tracing the line of my spine as if mapping a route. He didn't just listen. He poured gasoline on the embers of my resentment. He began to share his own stories, painting a portrait of Robert not as a benevolent father, but as a ruthless exploiter who used human beings as fuel for his empire. He told me, his voice a low vibrating rumble against my ear, about the MMA fights. He claimed that the fights weren't just a vanity project or a tax write-off for Robert. They were a washing machine for dirty money. He described shell companies, offshore accounts in the Caymans, and cash flows that bypassed the IRS completely. "He uses my blood to clean his money, Elena," Marcus whispered, his lips brushing my neck. "He throws me in the cage to get beaten half to death, so he can move his assets around. He despises us both. To him, I'm just a gladiator and you're just a concubine. We are the help." The plan was born in those moments of shared victimhood, constructed brick by brick in the twilight of our illicit afternoons. It wasn't a sudden revelation, but a slow, creeping inevitability. Marcus planted the seed, but he made me feel like the gardener who watered it. He mentioned with casual precision that he had seen Robert working on files late at night in the home office, files that didn't go into the digital server but were kept in the physical wall safe behind the Modigliani painting. If someone had those papers, Marcus mused, looking at the ceiling, they wouldn't need a lawyer. They would own him. The implication hung in the air, heavy and intoxicating. With proof of tax fraud and money laundering, the prenup would be worthless. I could blackmail Robert into a quiet, uncontested divorce with a settlement that would set me up for life. Or better yet, we could expose him, destroy his reputation, and watch his empire crumble while we walked away with the pieces. It was a fantasy of revenge so sweet it made my mouth water. "We can destroy the old man, Elena," Marcus promised, gripping my chin and forcing me to look into his eyes. "You have the brains. You have the access. I have the strength to protect us when it goes down. But we need the leverage." I looked at him, this powerful, dangerous man who seemed to hate Robert as much as I did, and I saw a savior. I didn't see a conspirator. I saw a dark knight in gym shorts who was offering to slay the dragon and liberate the princess. I believed him because I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that our connection was deep enough to justify treason. I wanted to believe that his hatred for his father was genuine. And so I agreed. I agreed to be the spy in my own home, to violate the sanctum of Robert's office, to become the instrument of his downfall. The fear that had initially held me back evaporated, replaced by a manic sense of purpose. I wasn't just a cheating wife anymore, I was a partner in a coup. The espionage began the very next week, during a window of opportunity when Robert was hosting a gala downstairs in the building's event hall. I feigned a migraine, excusing myself from the party early, leaving Robert to charm the donors alone. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I slipped into the study. The room smelled of Robert, cigars, old paper, and the sharp tang of ink, a scent that used to intimidate me but now just fueled my resolve. I went straight to the painting. I knew the combination to the safe. Robert had given it to me once years ago in a moment of arrogance, assuming I would never have the courage to use it. Right to 20, left to 10, right to 5. The tumblers clicked with a sound that felt loud as a gunshot in the silent room. The heavy steel door swung open, revealing rows of neatly stacked ledgers and black binders. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the first file I pulled out. I worked with a feverish efficiency, following Marcus's specific instructions. I wasn't looking for cash or jewelry. I was looking for the gray ledger, as Marcus called it, and the files marked with the names of shell corporations he had listed for me. I found them buried in the back, behind a stack of bonds. I opened the folders on Robert's desk, the desk where he had signed our marriage license, and began to photograph the documents with my smartphone. Pages of bank transfers, routing numbers, lists of payoffs. It was all there, a language of corruption I barely understood but knew was lethal. I felt a surge of adrenaline so potent it made me dizzy. I was stealing the keys to the kingdom. I was taking back the power he had stripped from me. Every click of the camera shutter felt like a slap in Robert's face, A small act of retribution for every dismissive comment and cold look he had ever given me. Once the photos were taken, I initiated the second part of the protocol. Marcus had set up a secure, encrypted email account for me, explaining that we couldn't risk using the cloud or regular messaging apps that Robert's IT team might monitor. I sat in my husband's leather chair, the glow of the phone screen illuminating my face in the dark room, and uploaded the images one by one. I watched the progress bar inch forward, sending the evidence into the digital void where Marcus could access it. Sent. The word appeared on the screen, innocent and final. I returned the files to the safe, wiped the desk with the hem of my robe to remove any fingerprints, and closed the painting. I stood there for a moment in the dark, breathing in the scent of the room, feeling a triumphant smile stretch across my face. I felt like the heroine of a spy novel, clever and brave, outsmarting the villain. I didn't see the shadows stretching out from the corners of the room to claim me. I didn't feel the cold reality of the trap closing around my ankle. I was so blinded by the glare of my own imagined victory that I didn't notice I was tying the noose around my own neck. The month of waiting felt less like a span of time and more like the slow, deliberate tightening of a violin string, winding the tension until the air in the penthouse vibrated with a frequency only I could hear. Day X, as I had christened it in the secret theater of my mind, arrived not with a fanfare but with the unexpected chime of the private elevator doors sliding open on a Tuesday afternoon. Robert was supposed to be in Zurich for another 3 days, attending a summit on global banking regulations, a boring alibi for what I assumed was just another week of hiding assets. I was in the library, reviewing the digital copies of the incriminating documents for the 100th time, when I heard the heavy thud of luggage being set down in the foyer. My heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against my ribs, not out of fear, but out of a sudden, sharp exhilaration. The waiting was over. The stage was set, the script was memorized, and the lead actor had just walked onto the set early. I checked my phone one last time, ensuring the encrypted folder was accessible, and slid it into the pocket of my silk trousers. It felt heavy there, a digital weapon capable of leveling an empire. I stood up, smoothing the fabric over my hips, and walked toward the study where I knew he would go first. I felt invincible, armored in his secrets and protected by the silent, muscular shadow I knew was lurking somewhere in the apartment. I found Robert in his sanctuary, the heavy oak-paneled study that smelled of old money and cigars. He was already seated behind his massive desk, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, looking as though he hadn't just crossed the Atlantic. He didn't look up when I entered. He continued to stare at a spot on the wall, his expression unreadable. I paused in the doorway, letting the silence stretch, savoring the power dynamic that I believed had just shifted irrevocably in my favor. For 3 years I had walked into this room as a petitioner, a decoration, a subordinate. Today I walked in as an executioner. "Welcome home, Robert," I said, my voice cool and steady, stripped of the breathless adoration I usually feigned. "You're back early. Which is fortunate because we need to talk. And not about the charity gala or your dinner preferences." I walked further into the room, my heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor, closing the distance between us until I stood directly opposite him, the desk acting as the only barrier. I didn't sit down. I wanted to loom over him. I wanted him to crane his neck to look at the woman who was about to destroy him. Robert finally shifted his gaze to me. He took a slow sip of his whiskey, the ice clinking softly against the crystal, and set the glass down with a deliberate, gentle movement. He didn't look tired from his travels. He looked calm, possessing a stillness that I initially mistook for resignation. "Elena," he said, acknowledging me with a nod that was polite but distant. "You seem agitated. Has something happened with the staff?" His tone was so dismissive, so patently condescending, that it fueled the fire in my belly. He still saw me as the trophy wife, the manager of domestic trivialities. He had no idea that the woman standing in front of him held the detonator to his life. I smiled, a sharp, razor-edged expression that felt foreign on my face. "The staff is fine, Robert. The problem is your accounting. Specifically, the offshore accounts in the Caymans and the shell companies in Panama that you used to funnel money from the fight rings." I dropped the words into the quiet room like stones into a pond, waiting for the ripples of panic to distort his composed features. I watched him closely, expecting the flinch, the widening of the eyes, the sudden pallor of a man caught red-handed. But Robert didn't flinch. He simply blinked slowly and reached for his glass again. "I see," he said, his voice remaining level, devoid of any alarm. "You've been busy, Elena. I thought you were spending your time shopping and socializing. It seems I underestimated your curiosity." His lack of fear was unsettling, a discordant note in the symphony of my triumph, but I pushed it aside. He was bluffing. He had to be. No man listens to his own felony indictment with such boredom unless he is in shock. I pulled the phone from my pocket and tapped the screen, holding it up so he could see the thumbnails of the documents, his ledgers, his signatures, the damning evidence of his fraud. "I have everything, Robert. Every transfer. Every illegal tax evasion. And it's not just on this phone. It's on a cloud server that will automatically email the IRS and the SEC if I don't enter a code every 24 hours. This is what is going to happen," I continued, my voice gaining strength, filling the room with the sound of my own emancipation. "We are going to call your lawyers. Today. We are going to draft a new postnuptial agreement. You are going to sign over 50% of your liquid assets to me immediately, and then we are going to file for a quiet, amicable divorce based on irreconcilable differences. You keep your reputation and I keep my mouth shut. If you refuse or if you try to fight me, I press send. And you spend the rest of your life in federal prison." I slammed the phone down on the desk for emphasis, the sound echoing like a gavel strike. I felt a rush of adrenaline so potent it made me dizzy. I had done it. I had spoken the words that freed me. I stood there, chest heaving, waiting for him to crumble, to beg, to negotiate. I was the queen of the chessboard and I had just called checkmate. Robert looked at the phone, then back up at me. For the first time, an expression broke through his mask of indifference. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was a look of profound, weary disappointment, the look a professor might give a student who had cheated on an exam but still failed to pass. He sighed, a long exhale through his nose, and shook his head slightly. 50%, he repeated, swirling the whiskey in his glass. "That's a very specific number, Elena. Ambitious, greedy, and entirely predictable." He leaned back in his leather chair, lacing his fingers together over his stomach. "You know, when I married you, I knew you were hungry. I liked that. Hunger makes people sharp. But I didn't realize your hunger would make you this stupid." The insult stung, but I laughed it off. He was lashing out because he was cornered. "Insults won't save you, Robert," I sneered. "I have the leverage. You have nothing." "I have nothing?" he asked softly, raising an eyebrow. "You think you are the only one in this house capable of strategy? You think because I am 45 and sit behind a desk that I am blind?" He looked at me with a pity that was more cutting than his anger would have been. "You stand there, counting my money, thinking you've won a game you don't even understand. You think you're a player, Elena. But you're just a piece." The confidence in his voice began to erode the edges of my certainty. Why wasn't he scared? Why wasn't he calling his lawyers? A cold prickle of doubt started at the base of my spine. I needed to end this. I needed to show him the true extent of my power. I needed to bring out the heavy artillery. I needed Marcus. "You think I'm alone in this?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You think I did this by myself? You underestimate how much people hate you, Robert. Even the people closest to you." I stepped back from the desk and turned toward the heavy mahogany door of the study. "Marcus," I called out, my voice ringing clear and authoritative. "Come in. He needs to know." This was the moment. This was the coup de grace. The moment the son would step out of the shadows and drive the dagger into the father's back. The moment Robert would realize he had lost everything. His money, his wife, and his legacy. I smiled at Robert, a cruel, triumphant curving of my lips, savoring the anticipation of his devastation. The door handle turned. The heavy door swung open on silent hinges, and Marcus stepped into the room. He looked magnificent and terrifying, filling the doorway with his sheer physical presence. He was dressed in dark clothes that accentuated the breadth of his shoulders, his face set in that familiar, unreadable mask of stone. I felt a surge of pride and lust seeing him. My partner. My lover. My enforcer. I took a step toward him, my body instinctively orienting itself to his, expecting him to come to my side. I expected him to stand next to me, to put a protective arm around my waist, to present a united front of youth and strength against the aging tyrant in the chair. "Tell him, Marcus," I said, breathless with excitement. "Tell him it's over." Marcus walked into the room. He moved with that prowling, predatory grace I knew so well, his eyes fixed straight ahead. But he didn't look at me. He didn't even blink in my direction. He walked right past me. The air displaced by his movement brushed against my skin, cold and indifferent. I froze, my hand half extended to touch him, as he strode purposefully toward the desk. He didn't stop at the guest chair. He didn't stop in the middle of the room. He walked around the massive oak desk and came to a halt directly behind Robert's right shoulder. He turned then, crossing his massive arms over his chest, and planted his feet in a wide, immovable stance. He stood there like a sentinel, a dark tower of loyalty and violence guarding the king. The silence that fell over the room was absolute. It was a physical thing, a vacuum that sucked the oxygen out of the air and left me gasping. I stood there, my hand still reaching out into empty space, my brain misfiring as it tried to process the visual data. Marcus was standing with Robert. He wasn't looking at me with love or conspiracy. He was looking at me with the same cold, detached boredom as his father. The triumphant smile slid off my face like melting wax, replaced by a mask of dawning horror. The adrenaline that had been making me feel like a giant suddenly turned toxic, curdling in my veins into a sick, heavy dread. The two men, the father in the suit and the son in the shadows, looked at me as one entity. They were a monolith. They were a fortress. And I was standing alone in the open field, holding a phone that suddenly felt like a toy, realizing with a terrifying clarity that I hadn't orchestrated a trap. I had walked into one. I stood frozen in the center of the study, a statue carved from ice and disbelief, my hand still extended toward a man who was no longer there. The smile on my face, which had been sharp and triumphant only seconds ago, began to dissolve, sliding off my skin like melting wax to reveal the raw, naked horror underneath. My brain stuttered, refusing to process the visual information in front of me. Marcus, my lover, my co-conspirator, standing like a Praetorian guard behind the husband we had sworn to destroy. The silence in the room was no longer empty. It was heavy with a crushing, suffocating weight, broken only by the sound of Robert sighing. It was a sound of immense boredom, the exhale of a man who has sat through a tedious play and is relieved the curtain is finally falling. He set his whiskey glass down on a leather coaster with a soft thud, opened the top drawer of his desk, and withdrew a thick, black folder. He didn't speak. He simply tossed it across the mahogany surface. It slid with a hiss, stopping inches from my paralyzed fingertips, the contents fanning out in a damning cascade of glossy images. I looked down and the floor seemed to drop out from under me. The photographs were high definition, brutal and undeniable. There was one of me in the gym, my hand resting on Marcus's chest, my face flushed with a hunger I had thought was private. There was another of us in the hallway during the storm, pressed against the wall, his hands tangled in my hair. There were shots taken from hidden angles in the guest's bedroom, capturing moments of intimacy that I had believed were stolen in the shadows, now exposed under the harsh fluorescent glare of Robert's office lighting. But the worst ones were the most recent, grainy but clear images of me in this very room, sitting at Robert's desk, photographing the documents from the safe. Every secret meeting, every whispered treason, every act of theft. It was all there, catalogued, time-stamped, and preserved. I had been performing in a glass house, thinking I was hidden in a bunker. The realization made bile rise in my throat. I hadn't been the spy. I had been the subject of the surveillance. Robert leaned back in his chair, lacing his fingers together over his stomach, and began to speak in a voice that was terrifyingly calm. It was not the voice of a victim or a rage-filled cuckold. It was the even modulated tone of a CEO explaining a restructuring plan. "You see, Elena," he began, gesturing vaguely at the photos, "I never buy an asset without a stress test. It's bad business. When I met you, I saw ambition. I liked that. But I needed to know if you were a partner or a predator." He looked at me with eyes that were cold and clear, stripped of any illusion of affection. I needed to know what you would do if you thought the fence was down. So I lowered the fence. I created a scenario where you could show me your true nature. He took a sip of his drink, savoring the devastation on my face. And you didn't disappoint. You performed exactly as predicted. You didn't want a marriage, you wanted a hostile takeover. You wanted to strip the copper wiring out of the walls before you burned the house down. I shook my head, a weak spasmodic denial, my eyes darting to Marcus. But, us, I whispered, my voice cracking. The hate. You hate him. You told me. Robert chuckled, a dry sound like leaves scraping on pavement. Marcus? He asked, glancing up at his son with a look of genuine pride. Marcus doesn't hate me. Marcus is the only person in this world I trust with my life. He isn't a charity case, Elena. He is my right hand. He runs my security. He handles my most sensitive negotiations. Everything he told you, the abuse, the money laundering, the resentment, was a script. We wrote it together over dinner 3 months ago. Robert smiled, a thin, cruel curving of his lips. We needed to see if you would try to turn him. We needed to see if you were capable of seducing a son to kill his father. And you were. You were so eager. You jumped into bed with him not because you loved him, but because you thought he was a weapon you could aim at me. The cruelty of the revelation pierced me deeper than any knife. It wasn't just the trap. It was the intimacy of the betrayal. The nights we had spent together, the confessions, the shared vulnerability, it was all a lie. Marcus had been working. Every touch was a tactic. Every kiss was a maneuver. I looked at Marcus, really looked at him, searching for a crack in the stone facade. I searched for the man who had held me in the dark and told me I was his savior. But that man didn't exist. The man standing behind Robert was a soldier who had successfully completed a mission. He looked at me with eyes that were empty of passion, empty of hate, empty of anything human. I was just a target he had neutralized. The documents I had photographed, the evidence of tax fraud I thought gave me leverage? Fake, Robert said, answering the question before I could ask it. Fabricated ledgers. Planted for you to find. They are meaningless. You have nothing, Elena. Absolutely nothing. Robert stood up then, signaling the end of the meeting. He smoothed his tie, looking bored. Now regarding your exit, he said, picking up a document from his desk. The prenuptial agreement you signed had a very specific morality clause. Infidelity voids all financial settlements. And as you can see from the spread on my desk, we have ample proof of infidelity. He dropped the paper on top of the photos. You get 0. No alimony. No lump sum. You don't even get to keep the jewelry, as those were gifts conditional on the marriage. He paused, his eyes hardening. However, I am a generous man. I will not have you arrested for corporate espionage and the theft of private documents, crimes for which I could send you to federal prison for 10 years, provided you leave this apartment in the next 60 minutes and never speak my name again. If you talk to the press, if you hire a lawyer, if you so much as breathe in my direction, I will hand these photos and your confession to the district attorney. It was an annihilation. He wasn't just divorcing me. He was erasing me. I felt the room spinning, the air growing too thin to breathe. I looked at Marcus one last time, a desperate, silent plea for mercy. I wanted him to say something, anything. I wanted him to acknowledge that at least the physical act had been real, that for a moment he had felt something other than contempt. Please, my eyes screamed. We were lovers. Marcus held my gaze for a second. Then, slowly, deliberately, he looked down at his father and gave a single short nod. It was a gesture of respect, of closure, of a job well done. Then he looked back at me with the cold, dead eyes of a shark and looked right through me, as if I were already a ghost. He didn't even blink. That indifference broke the last strut of my composure. A sob tore out of my throat, a ragged, ugly sound of total defeat. I turned and ran. I fled the study, stumbling in my heels, blinded by a hot rush of tears that burned my cheeks. I ran through the penthouse that I had thought was my kingdom, past the art I had planned to sell, past the furniture I had planned to burn. I didn't stop to look at the view. I ran to the bedroom, my hands shaking so violently I could barely open the closet. I didn't pack my clothes. I grabbed handfuls of fabric blindly, shoving them into a single suitcase. Jeans, sweaters, things from my old life. I left the couture gowns hanging like colorful ghosts. I ripped the diamond earrings from my ears and threw them on the vanity, the metal clattering against the glass. I stripped the wedding band from my finger and left it beside them. I took nothing that belonged to Robert. I took nothing that belonged to the lie. 60 minutes later, the heavy brass doors of the building lobby swung shut behind me with a final echoing thud. The doorman, a man I had greeted every day for 3 years, looked through me as if I were a stranger, having clearly received the call from upstairs. I stood on the sidewalk, the cold wind of the metropolis whipping my hair across my face, stinging my tear-streaked skin. I gripped the handle of my single suitcase, my knuckles white, shivering in my thin coat. The city moved around me loud and indifferent, a river of yellow taxis and rushing pedestrians who didn't care that my life had just ended. I was just another piece of debris washed up on the concrete shore of Manhattan. Slowly, against my will, I tilted my head back. I looked up, past the streetlights, past the grime of the lower floors, up to the dizzying height of the 60th floor. The penthouse windows were glowing like gold ingots against the black night sky, warm and inviting. I imagined them up there. Robert pouring another whiskey. Marcus loosening his tie, perhaps laughing for the first time. The father and son toasting their victory. They were celebrating the successful extermination of a pest. They were bonding over my destruction. I stood there for a long moment, the bitter taste of ash in my mouth, feeling the crushing weight of my own greed. I had tried to play a game against the masters of the universe, and I had lost everything. I turned my collar up against the wind, gripped my handle, and walked into the darkness, a queen who had become a pauper in the span of an hour, swallowed whole by the city I thought I could conquer.